and welcome to this breath connection, breath inquiry practice video. It's a pleasure to have you here. So I just wanted to begin by giving us a very brief introduction to the breath, and particularly if you're new to breath practices, you might find this helpful. So the first thing to remember is that the breath is the practice. So I know in modern times, in modern yoga practices, the breath has become somewhat devalued and deprioritized. The way in which yoga is taught and presented leads us to believe that it is the postures that are the central point of the practice. And whilst they are incredibly important, so is the breath. And actually, when we use the breath as a guide, as the powerhouse, as the source of the practice, the movement practice, we find that real magic happens. So that's the first thing to appreciate. The second is that obviously we spend a day in, day out, inspiring, expiring. And because it's always going on in the background, that can be another reason why it's very easy to take it for granted and not appreciate its power. But the breath is an incredibly powerful tool, both from a therapeutic perspective and also an energetic perspective. So the breath offers us a window into our physiology. So the way in which the body functions, all the little bits and pieces of roles and tasks and jobs that our bodies perform, our cells perform, that's our physiology. And we can access that and we can change that through the use of the breath. We can also access and change our mind, our thoughts and our moods. So from a yoga therapy perspective, there's a huge amount that we can influence for the better with the breath. And that isn't just in disease, it's in wellness too. So you don't have to be unwell for the breath to have a positive influence. You can just improve on something that's already functioning well. We can still go further and work towards that real wellness. And thirdly, there's two aspects to observing the breath, really. The first one is the sensation of the breath occurring, which is something that we're going to go through in a couple of minutes. So how the breath feels in the body as it's happening. But secondly, it's the awareness of the effect of the breath on the mind. Now, that's something that we're going to step away from a little bit today. I don't want to get into an analysis of what the breath is doing or whether that's a good or a bad thing. We're just going to start out with appreciating what's happening and taking it without judgment for what it is today. And lastly, you do not have to engage in complex pranayama practices to be doing yogic breathing or yogic breath awareness exercises. I have lost count of the number of times a student or friend has said to me, no, I just know it's not for me. I find it really triggering and anxiety provoking. And I say, okay, and what is it that you've done? And it's usually when people have done breath holding or fast breathing or even breath counts. they're not for everybody, and they can often take a lot of time and work and practice with an experienced teacher to be of benefit. And often they put people off completely. So the last thing that I'm trying to tell you here is that you do not need to do any of that. That's not a prerequisite to doing yogic breathing exercises. So we're going to get started with our practice for today, just 5 or so minutes, maybe a little bit longer. And all we're doing is asking ourselves how we breathe. And as I touched on, I'd like us to step away from any judgments about what that means or why that might be. We're simply noticing today. And you may wish to do that with somebody, or you may wish to do it on your own. So you can choose to have somebody with you and they observe your breathing pattern, which can be helpful, potentially if you're going to compare what they observed with what you experienced. But again, it's important to step away from any judgments. We're just noticing. You may prefer to do it on your own. Perhaps you've got a journal you'd like to scribble in, to see how things are. And it can be nice, especially when you journal, to then compare, see if things are changing, noticing cycles, rhythms, influences, things like that. Again, we're moving more towards analysing if we're doing that, but helpful longer term to maybe write things down. So I'm going to guide you through this practice in Sukhasana, roughly translated as easy cross legs. There's a number of different postures, positions you can do this practice in. Constructive rest. Constructive rest is a very popular one. That is lying supine on the back with the legs bent and the soles of the feet on the floor. So you're welcome to practice like that too. Or seated on a chair if you're not comfortable with the legs crossed. Okay. So we're just going to take a few moments to get comfortable, perhaps change into any of those positions I've just suggested. You might wish to gather props, cushions to make sure that you're comfortable. It's helpful if you are comfortable because distraction from the breathing can hinder your ability to notice what's going on. And for this first little bit, you may wish to place a hand on your heart, a hand on your tummy. Having that visceral touch connection to the movement of the breath can be really helpful. You can feel the gross movement of the chest this way. And we're just going to let ourselves settle in. We're not changing anything. We're going to step away from those thoughts that ascribe a rightness or a wrongness to a certain pattern. We're going to really tune in and try to appreciate and notice all the subtleties within the inspiration and the expiration. Any jerks, pauses, roughness. And we're just going to take it all for what it is. And I'm going to start by asking you where it is you feel your breath. If the hands are on the chest and the tummy, I'd encourage you to take them away now. Either placing them in your lap or on your knees, or if you're on your back in constructive rest, slightly out to the sides of the body, palms facing upwards. So you have the freedom to explore where you feel the breath. Is it in the lower part of the body? The upper part? In the top of the chest? And what is the quality of the breath? Is it smooth? Is it steady? Is it rough? Is it catching? Does it feel difficult? Often, if we're not used to observing our breath, it can feel hard to do so. Especially hard to step away from the part of the mind that tries to change it. Just letting things be what they are. Do I feel any tension or restlessness anywhere? If you're not comfortable, you can always find the freedom to move. Perhaps if your legs were crossed, it's time to uncross them or change the cross. And once we've grasped the location and the quality of the breath, we can move into asking ourselves some questions. And the first one I'd like you to consider today is, where is the origin of the breath? So just as an earthquake has an epicenter, so does the breath. Where does your breath originate from? Is it from the crus of the diaphragm, pulling the diaphragm down and allowing the ribs to fill, the lungs to fill. Is it across the chest? Is it the lower ribs? Stepping away from making any judgments and just noticing things for what they are. Where is it in our chest and torso that we feel the contraction of the exhalation and the expansion of the inhalation? Perhaps if we're sat up, we're slightly freer to explore that. If we're on our backs, we have the feedback of the mat or the floor against our backs. Perhaps meaning that we're more inclined to feel it in those places of contact. Again, nothing right or wrong, we're just noticing. How are the inhalations and exhalations feeling? Are there any pauses between my inhalations and exhalations, or exhalations and inhalations? If I'm making a sound while I'm breathing, what's the quality of this sound? This is much more easy to recognize in Ujjayi. If you're familiar with Ujjayi, feel free to take it now. Ujjayi is a breath method in which we slightly constrict the throat to make an ocean sound. How is the rhythm of my breath over several cycles? We've been sat a while now, and are likely to have dropped into our natural breathing pattern. We've given time to settle, and how are things feeling now? Letting go of any questions now. Just spending these last few minutes with the breath. When you're ready, returning, if you are laid down, to a comfortable seated position. Perhaps you'd like to pick up your notebook if you are planning on making some notes. And lastly, just pausing and noticing how the whole experience of sitting in observation there has made you feel. As I mentioned, it may have been challenging for you. That's not unusual or uncommon. Often we find it influences the mind in one way or another. And I'm resisting from offering you suggestions or ideas as to what might have shifted for you, because I'd love for you to explore that yourself. So feel free to scribble the answers to those questions down. We went over a lot there. Don't worry if you haven't or weren't able to observe everything. As I said, it's just a gentle introduction. We're just beginning with understanding how we breathe. I hope you found that useful, and I'll certainly be sharing more in-depth inquiries over time. But that's always, this exercise is always a good place to start and a good place to return to. So thank you so much, and I'll see